right, this is Mr. Kyle, Myers Mathematics, and let's just jump into it here. This is today, as of this time, 7/23/24. I like to say period 4 because I put these out at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesdays, so that's when these will always go out. But this particular one is on using the quadratic formula. So in order to do that, we're going to need the quadratic formula, which I have up at the top there. Hopefully you can read that all right. I just kind of penciled it in. X is equal to, all of the next stuff is all in the numerator. So X is equal to negative B plus or minus, so both plus and minus, the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all over 2A. What's A, what's B, what's C is the first and most important thing to do. You can either do this by hand, or you can kind of just acknowledge it, but I would highly recommend making sure you clearly know what A, B, and C are. It's really easy to miss a sign, and if you miss a sign on one of your letters at the very beginning, it just messes everything else up, and then when you go back to fix it, you have to start back from the very beginning. So definitely make sure you have the signs right. You don't necessarily have to write it out every time, but if you're just starting out with this, probably I would recommend doing that. I would recommend doing that, writing them out, just until you get the hang of it, and especially if you're not getting the right answers just yet, if you're having trouble with it. So that's what I would recommend. If you're a more seasoned expert, then maybe just acknowledging what A, B, and C are, making sure you have the right signs especially. All right, so let's go ahead and start. Now, this part, like I said on the last video on numbers 1 and 2, is going to be sort of optional. It's just how I like to do things so that it's nice and neat and organized. But what I like to do is I actually like to have 2 columns. And on the right side column or left side column, it kind of just depends. I normally go and start out on the right side column, not for any particular reason. I like to do the part that's under the radical first, because that's the part that takes the longest. Everything else doesn't take nearly as long. So as far as cleaning up the other stuff that's, not part of the radical individually. So I like to do the part that's under the radical first. B is 2, so this would be 2 squared minus 4AC. All right, so let's see what that's supposed to be. 2 squared is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 12, 56? No, sorry. 96 is what I meant to say. Or if you wanted to do it a different way, you could just double the 12. 4 and 2 is basically 3 2s, so you could just double 12 3 times. So 12 doubled the first time would be 24. Double it again, 48. Double it again, 96. So either way, and this is a minus and a minus, that's going to be plus 96. Ah, well that's the square root of 100. And the square root of 100 is 10. Oh, that cleaned up pretty nicely, actually. So now what I do is I come over here and I say, okay, so I'm going to do the rest of the formula now. X is equal to negative b, so negative 2, plus or minus, and now I don't have to write out all of this stuff because I already did all of this next part. I just know that I'm going to put a 10 right here because 10 is the square root of b squared minus 4ac. All over 2a. All right, and now I can clean it up a little bit. I'm really only going to need probably one step to clean this up because then after that I'll have to split the fraction into the plus and the minus versions. So negative 2 plus or minus 10 over 4. And at this point, there's not really too much else that you can do. So let's do this. The minus we'll have is yellow. So the yellow version would be negative 2 minus 10. Negative 2 minus 10, you'd be adding the two negatives. It's like negative 2 plus negative 10, which is negative 12 over 4 is going to be negative 3. Okay. And then the plus version. So the plus version, let's see if I can, I'll probably just have to scroll down a little bit. Yeah, that's better. That way I'm not trying to squeeze it in. So the plus version, negative 2 plus 10 is actually the same thing as 10 minus 2. You can switch the signs, or not switch the signs, but switch the numbers around as long as the signs stay in front of those numbers. So for instance, negative 2 plus negative 10, I could have said that's negative 10 plus negative 2. That would have been the same thing. Negative 2 plus 10 is the same thing as 10 minus 2, or 10 plus negative 2. 10 minus 2 is 8, so that would be 8 over 4. So just to get that straight here, that's negative 2 plus 10 is 8. which is also the same thing as 10 minus 2. So 8 over 4, which is 2, and there's my other answer. All right, awesome. So at this point, you're basically done, but if you want to check your work, you can just plug them back in. So 2 times negative 3 squared, negative 3 squared would be 9. 9 times 2 is 18. Okay, 18. Negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 plus negative 12 is negative 18. 18 minus 18 is 0. So the negative 3 works. All right, then if you tried the 2, 2 times 2 squared, 2 squared is 4, times 2 is 8, 2 times 2 is 4, 8 plus 4 is 12, 12 minus 12 is 0. So you can plug them back in, you can check them, you can do all of that on the calculator. It's a pretty neat way to check your answer to make sure that you have the right answer. I would recommend doing that highly, highly, highly on a test, probably even a quiz, if you really want to be serious about getting a good grade in class. Check your work. Definitely doesn't take that long, especially with a calculator. All right, moving on to number 4. Let's jump at it. Oh, and one more thing. With number 3, we could have done this at the beginning, and I thought about doing this, but I was like, well, we're still kind of early on the worksheet, so I don't want to do it this way. But if you're a little bit more experienced, or if you just saw that this happened, or the teacher showed you how to do it this way, you could have factored out a 2 from all 3 terms at the very beginning. And or you could just divide it out, because if you divide everything by 2, then it just kind of goes away, because 0 divided by 2 is 0. So you could have done that, and then A would have been 1, and B would be 1, and C would be negative 6. You could have done it that way, and it would have been easier. However, it would have been faster and easier to do it that way, but it's not as simple as just find out what A, B, and C are, and then plug them into the formula, right? So at the very basics of all this, we want to make sure that we're not trying to overcomplicate things necessarily. The main 2 things you need are identify A, B, and C, and plug them into the formula. And I guess the third step would be to simplify, because you could maybe say plugging them in is just as important as the simplifying process. Because plugging them in properly is really important too, which is why I put lots of parentheses on stuff. Okay, so number 4. This time we can't do that little trick I just mentioned, because 2, 3, and 5 don't all divide by the same thing. If you tried to divide them by anything, something would end up as a decimal, right? So A is 2. So I'll write this off to the side over here maybe. We'll write this above it. I have space for it. A is 2. B is negative 3. C is negative 5. Right? Always include that minus sign as a negative. Be really careful with that. All right, so now we're going to do the part that's under the radical is called the discriminant. And it's just always what it's been called since I was learning it in grade school myself, but it's just what they call it. I think it has to do with like the result of what's under the radical will determine how many answers there is, and so that's just the term that people came up with it a long time ago. But anyways, let's go ahead and plug stuff in here. So b squared, b is negative 3, negative 3 squared, minus 4a c, and I'm going to have to move it over just a little bit. All right, there you go. So negative 3 squared is still positive 9. Minus 4 times 2 would be a minus 8 times 5 would be a minus, I just blanked, minus 40. Or you can say 2 times 5 is 10, 10 times 4 is 40, and that's going to be a plus, so plus 40. 9 plus 40 is 49. And the square root of 49 is 7. That worked out pretty nicely as well. Okay, so now we do the part with the rest of the quadratic formula. X is equal to negative b. Be really careful plugging these in. When b is already negative, it doesn't stay negative, it becomes positive, right? It's the opposite of whatever b is. So if b is negative, then this will end up being a plus 3. Be really careful there. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, which we already found out was 7 all over 2a. Okay, so that is a positive 3 plus or minus a 7 all over a 4. Okay, and that's going to turn into 2 different answers. So we have the positive answer. We'll do the positive answer first this time, I guess. So x will be equal to 10. 3 plus 7 is 10. 10 over 4. which doesn't divide evenly, but it does simplify a little bit. So I would say that writing it as 5 halves would be fine. I forgot to box my other answers, by the way. Box this answer over here. I would say that writing it as 5 halves is fine. If your teacher prefers decimals, then you would write it as 2.5. But I would say most of the time fractions are fine. What I would not do is I would not write it as a mixed number, unless, of course, the teacher wants you to because they're the one grading it. But typically at this stage in mathematics, you're not trying to write numbers as mixed numbers anymore. They're either proper fractions or improper fractions. 5/2 is an improper fraction, which is a little misleading because it's actually considered to be fine. it's not considered to be improper, like if you're being rude to somebody or something. But anyways, so x is equal to, now we're doing the negative version, 3 minus 7. Well, 3 minus 7 is the same thing as negative 7 plus 3. It's the opposite of 7 minus 3. If you're subtracting two numbers and you flip the numbers, you're going to get the opposite of the answer you want, which actually seems like something you wouldn't want to do, but it's actually one thing that I recommend people do because I think it's more helpful to see it as 7 minus 3. 3 minus 7 is a little harder to wrap your mind around. But 7 minus 3, you probably learned that in kindergarten or first grade, or maybe even earlier than that. 7 minus 3 is 4. Okay, well then 3 minus 7 would have to be negative 4. Right? See how we did that? So negative 4 over 4. Anything over itself is 1, but this has a negative in it, so it'll be a negative 1. Let me go ahead and box my other answer because I totally forgot to do that. And there we go. And again, you can plug these back in. I don't think I'll plug in the 5 halves this time. I plugged in both of them for number 3, but for number 4 here, I don't think I'll plug in both. But negative 1, if you plug that in, it'd be negative 1 squared is positive 1 times 2 is 2. Then negative 3 times negative 1 is positive 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. 5 minus 5 is 0. So the negative 1 definitely works. I'm sure the 5 halves also works. It's a little harder to just kind of plug in. I mean, I could do it, but you can do it on a calculator. Or if you are taking a test, I probably would check it. If it's a fraction, I would wait till you've checked everything else first, just because fractions take longer to plug in and do the math for. They're a little more difficult to do by hand if you have to do it by hand. But I would check everything. If you're taking a test, I would check every single answer just to make sure you didn't make any little mistakes. Because that's the one thing about math is that it's a little unforgiving sometimes. So that's my 2 cents for worth exactly 2 cents, which doesn't really buy anything these days. But that's my 2 cents. So hopefully that's been helpful. Check out the other videos. There's one video before this, 1 and 2. I think I'll also try to see if I can find that video on the quadratic formula song and see if I can post that in there too. Because that's a helpful thing to do is to like put a formula to song to help to remember it. So hopefully that video will be helpful to you. And yeah, check out my other stuff on here and on my website, myersmathematics.com. I have the 5 math mistakes everyone makes and how to avoid them. Long title, good little PDF to keep track of what kinds of mistakes to be looking out for and how to avoid making them. It's on my website, Myers Mathematics, which is in the description below. So go check that out, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Blessings, y'all.